In English, and I hope it will be okay. So please tell me if I speak too low or if it's not understandable. So Granada, like Venice or New York, for instance, is what we commonly call a mythical city. That is a city where the present continues to return to the past in a stereotypical way, following what we think is a clear ideological narrative. The conquest of Granada by the Catholic kings Isabella and Ferdinand in 1492 was indeed a turning point in the history of Western Europe. It gives the evidence of the presence and dying of a Baroque Islam in Western Europe and of the regulation of a painful identity confrontation that contributed to the construction of Europe. But how did Granada deal with this glorious past in the following period, after she disappeared from under the spotlight? Local accounts, in which celebrations and rituals take a major part, allow us to read differently how the town understood and instrumented its memory in a changing context. I will start by discussing why it seems to me useful to use the myth as an analytical framework to understand the history of a city on the long run, and why the celebrations are a particularly rich source for studying the myth in early modern times. I will then point out the major expressions of the myth of Granada from the conquest until the 18th century, insisting on the breaks provided by crises and political changes. So why the myth? The use of the myth as a historical object like others, as Louis Cardaillac pointed out in an interesting article, has been developed in the historical frame since a few decades, and it has, in my view, several advantages in the rather blurred frame of the contemporary studies on collective memory and identity. The word carries the idea of a specific speech on the past, which is a kind of lieu de mémoire in itself, transmitted and affected by the present. Secondly, following the Greek paradigm, the myth carries the meaning of false narrative, false speech, which is an advantage because it helps the historian to keep a certain distance with his object and therefore to question its political and social meaning within the studied community. And finally, the word myth contains also a certain idea of unconsciousness, emotion, and superior normativity, all dimensions that are, in my view, not enough studied in history for the moment and should be taken into account. In the Baroque period, in the Catholic West European countries, the myth was particularly expressed in the rituals and celebrations. Celebrations were given a central place in the urban life, in the conscience of the local authorities, as in the local histories. These celebrations addressed to the population both as civitas, this is the community of citizens, and of ecclesia, the assembly of the faithful. They displayed the civic consciousness and pride, its links to the wider communitas of the realm, and to the idealist eternity of its social and political order. They confirmed the local legends, which supported in turn the privileges of the town against the increasing intrusion of royal institutions, because the rituals of former times gave legitimacy to the present. Civico-religious festivals were organized for a great variety of reasons: birth and burials of kings, military events, calamities, canonizations, local commemoration, etc. Celebrations and the written and iconographic traces they left in the local environment developed a collective identity based on selected memories. By studying all these celebrations and the details we have over a long period, we can isolate recurring themes and symbolic references that are transmitted from generation to generation. We can see that from a hard core which remains almost unchanged over the time, their meaning varies according to the context and is particularly influenced by major historical breaks. We thus see how is constantly formulated and adapted a shared narrative dealing with contemporary issues of power, identity, and memory. So the main topics that constitute the myth of Granada after 1492, and which I will be talking about, are first the conquest and therefore the fundamental link of the city with the kings. Secondly, the martyrs who establish a link between a Romanized Christian antiquity and the new Christian city. And finally, the Virgin Mary, image of collective purification and majesty, who unites and fixes the different themes of the myth. So first, let's start with the royal myth. So I will start by showing you a map of the Habsburg Empire of Charles V, and where the arrow is Granada, in case there is a doubt. So the conquest naturally forms the core of the myth of Granada. The Catholic kings Ferdinand and Isabella entered the city on January the 6th of 1492. After 10 years of war, the last Muslim stronghold of the Spanish peninsula disappeared forever. This event was celebrated throughout Europe as the warning sign of the imminent arrival of the Parousia, the victory of Christianity in the world. And a few months later, the discovery of America confirmed the divine favor granted to Spain, to which was entrusted the mission to unite the world under the Christian faith. So we can see here pictured this ideological project. Granada as the promised city constituted the decor for this nativity known as the Virgin of Granada, painted by a Flemish painter of the surrounding of the Catholic kings. The kings dotted Granada with prestigious institutions and noble titles. In addition, the king chose to be buried in a chapel built aside the great mosque turned into a cathedral. The Emperor Charles V further increased Granada's symbolic position by turning the personal chapel of the Catholic kings into the pantheon of the new Habsburg dynasty. This confirmed the divine grace on his reign and his family, and highlighted the importance of Granada in the ideological frame of the empire. Until the mid-16th century, the successive arrivals of royal bodies and the royal celebrations sealed the alliance of the new community with the kings. But how this unique role could fit with reality? The conquest of Granada had erased all in a sudden the history of the 7 past centuries, performing like a miraculous loop over the Islamic period. But this event was also a turning point. 1492 was opening a time of new expectations and values, while closing definitively the ancient one. And this had 2 consequences. First, locally, the broad symbolic meaning of this event couldn't veil any longer the complex reality the city had inherited after the conquest. Indeed, a peaceful coexistence between Christians and Muslim autochthons soon became impossible. And a few years after the conquest, the Mudejares, that is the Muslim population, were forced to choose between exile and a conversion that offered them only a secondary status, the one of new Christians, or Moriscos. So that's an image of a Morisco dance in the beginning of the 16th century. The second consequence was that the conquest was not enough in itself to play the part of a foundation narrative necessary to build a collective identity for the new Hispanic city. While nobility was becoming essential to defend the city against the growing interference of the royal power, the victory was too fresh to qualify the nobility of the town, nobility that was acknowledged mainly by antiquity, the antiquity of history. Also, the new settlers couldn't just identify themselves with the conquerors, with the conquistadores, because this underlined they were newcomers, that is, illegitimate invaders. Following the medieval tradition, the war against the Muslims was war for the restoration of Spain, and the new colons were the legitimate first inhabitants of the land. In other words, the Christian settlers needed to found their autochthony to become themselves the original inhabitants of a territory already occupied by others, the disqualified Moriscos. So martyrdom played a major role in the grounding of the local autochthony. It is the second expression of the myth I will be discussing now. Numerous accounts of martyrs circulated since the Middle Ages and helped to build a sacred geography in the newly Christianized city. Also, at the beginning of the 16th century, within the context of the Mediterranean conflict with the Ottoman Empire and the religious wars in Europe, the martyr became an up-to-date figure. In this context, the authorities were more and more concerned about the situation in Granada. This peripheral kingdom where lived many descendants of Muslims, considered as possible traitors. By the mid-16th century, Granada no longer represented the optimistic promise of a unified world under the banner of the cross, but a religious and ethnic diversity now suspect and despised. From New Jerusalem, Granada had turned to be a new Babylonia. Charles V's son, the King Philip II, the most powerful West European sovereign of the second half of the 16th century, confronted to the Ottoman Empire and to the desire of independence of the margins of his inherited territories, especially in Flanders, made the choice of an authoritarian politics of religious and political standardization. In this context, Granada's Morisco question became an urgent issue. In 1568, driven to despair by the increasing harassment to which they were subjected, the Moriscos of Granada rebelled. For the authorities, it was an opportunity to put an end to an intolerable situation of political and religious disorder. This resulted in a violent and traumatic civil war, which attempted to solve the complex questions of identity of the colonial territory. After their defeat in 1570, tens of thousands of Moriscos were expelled in terrible conditions from the Kingdom of Granada. But the punishment of Granada didn't end here. A few years later, the king decided to withdraw the royal bodies that had been buried in the city and to install them in a new prominent pantheon near Madrid in the middle of the peninsula, the famous El Escorial. So this double loss of the Morisco population and culture on the one hand, of the royal bodies on the other, provoked a forced shift of the memory and the official narrative which the Grenadian society had built itself on. 20 years after the revolt and the expulsion of the Moriscos, between 1588 and 1596, human ashes were found on a hill near the city, soon called the Sacrament, Mount Saint. Accompanying texts explain conveniently they were the remains of San Cecilio, an Arab converted to Christianity by Jesus and sent by Saint Paul with other companions to evangelize the West in the antiquity. These false relics, designed in reality by a group of cultured Moriscos seeking to maintain the memory of the lost minority, had an unexpected success. Indeed, Cecilio was a perfect candidate to become a saint patron in the city. He assembled the old and new canons of holiness, the wonderful and the modern and rational authority of the Church. He was also a syncretic saint, a converted Arab who brought together two worlds and two opposed religions. So you can see here different moments of the discoveries and the devotions they brought to. You can see the authorities processing, going on pilgrimage to the hill, the relics being confirmed by the Archbishop, and on the top, the first discoveries. So San Cecilio became patron of the city through popular consensus, and the Cathedral of Granada was awarded the title of apostolic. The promotion of the cult of San Cecilio and its integration in local histories settled the reality of the forgeries in a characteristic Tridentine way. Indeed, the new light the discoveries shed on the past allowed to rewrite the history of the city, which so far was very obscure and mainly based on the break caused by the conquest and the Christianization. Following the common frame given by medieval chronicles, Granada became a city evangelized since Roman times, instead of a former Muslim town naturally suspected because of its recent foundation and ethnic diversity. Also, the discoveries had the advantage to release Granada from her exclusive link to the kings. Her Christian history didn't begin anymore with the conquest, but long before, and therefore shared the common memory of other Castilian towns. Thus, although the discoveries were quickly suspected and condemned as heretical by the papacy at the end of the century, although San Cecilio was never granted an important popular cult in Granada, the integration of the prodigious discoveries into the myth is the key to the understanding of the later expression of the Grenadian civic identity. So the third topic I will discuss now is the way the Marian devotions combined different elements of the myth and made it change again in the 17th century. The Virgin, leader of the wars against the Moors since the early Middle Ages, was naturally already a fundamental figure in Granada. After the Council of Trent, Marian devotions became the main source of religious renewal and political unification in the Hispanic world. The Virgin Mary provided social and political models and imposed a civic and patriotic consciousness grounded on the supreme value of nobility. In the 17th century, the end of the 30 Years' War marked the defeat of Spain's messianic political project in front of more integrated and pragmatic states. And from then on, the Weeping Virgin evoked a royal power considered as sacrificial in a country increasingly aware of its decline. In Granada, a local Pietà, the Virgin of the Angustias, which is in the middle, became the main Marian devotion. She soon replaced the previous patroness of the city, the austere Virgen de la Antigua, which is the first one on the left. The Angustias had indeed quite a few assets. She was a miraculous and therefore native image, and she was also linked to the kings and to the glory of the conquest. Thus she assembled the three main topics of the myth, that is the glory of the conquest, the suffering of the martyr, and the autochthony. In other words, victory, antiquity, and nobility. And meanwhile, a new international devotion was bridging together the Marian devotions, and that is the Immaculada Concepción, the last one. And she stood on a column at the entrance of the city where the kings usually arrived when they visited Granada. As an invincible icon, she manifested the continuity of the ideology of the universal conquest which Granada embodied, especially during the festivities on the occasion of battles of the royal armies. By the end of the 17th century, Granada had settled the main terms of its collective narrative, the kings and the conquest, the martyrs and the Virgin Mary. This development is mythical because it is not a rational account which can be told from the beginning to the end. Instead, it is full of contradictions which attest its royal and ritual transmission. The myth is grounded on an identity paradox. While claiming they are the descendants of the conquerors of Granada, the Grenadines insist on their autochthony. They descend from the primitive Grenadines and the martyrs of the Sacrament as sacred ancestors. The mythical narrative reflects the major historical breaks that the city has experienced and the debates concerning civic identity and therefore memory. It shows how Granada always tried to seek a balance that preserved the glorious past of the city without condemning her as marginal. This is why the myth is also a tool for understanding the shared ideology of the Hispanic kingdoms and their fundamental unity. Granada's case could also be useful, I think, to undertake comparative studies on myth through celebrations. Because in the end, as we have seen here through past contributions, all communities have their myth. They all invent and reinvent the past for the use of the present to bring up a suitable collective narrative and a position in their political environment. Thank you.
Thank you.